if you want to freeze a Democrat politician or a Republican politician, here's how you freeze them. You know, total solid ice. Here's what you say. Politician, tell me one time when you significantly disagree with the Israeli government policy toward the Palestinians. Whew, just like that. They freeze. Because they're part of the Washington puppet show. And it's about time the American people produced a Washington peace show to support the majority of people in Israel and Palestine want a two-state solution, instead of supporting with $4 or $5 billion the hardliners, who are a minority. The majority of Jewish Americans, Arab Americans, want a two-state solution. The peace movement in Israel gets suppressed once in a while when they're fighting, but it involves former generals, former security chiefs, mayors, members of the Knesset, small parties, politicians, leading intellectuals. Why isn't our government supporting the Israeli peace movement that has worked out the solutions with the Palestinian peace movement for years? Isn't that the way to settle down a conflict that's radiating throughout a third of the world against us? No, because the majority of the people want this settled, a tidy clique don't, and who wins? There's no democracy in foreign policy, in military policy. 70% of the people want out of Iraq. Doesn't mean anything. Dick Cheney said, so? Remember that one? Said, so? Well, Bush and Cheney are basically the most multiply impeachable president and vice president in American history. Five categories. A criminal war of aggression that continues. Million Iraqi lives lost, thousands of U.S. soldiers, and tens of thousands of soldiers injured. That's impeachable offense number one. Systemic torture, again and again, still going on. This is no one episode Watergate, or lying under oath about sex. These are recidivists. That's impeachable. Arresting thousands of Americans, throwing them in jail without charges, denying habeas corpus, impeachable. Spying on thousands of Americans week after week without judicial warrant. That's a 5-year jail term under FISA. It's a felony. Bush and Cheney have virtually admitted it. Everything, of course, is the war on stateless terrorism. And last, signing statements. You know, Bush has signed 800 bills in Congress, and he's put out a statement saying he'll decide whether to obey it or not, including John McCain's prescription against torture that he got through Congress. No, all the presidents before Bush, going back to George Washington, haven't signed that many signed statements. The American Bar Association president thinks that Bush has committed impeachable offenses. That's a very conservative giant bar association. And the American people, if the Democrats would inform them about all this, there's no doubt a majority would go for impeachment. In fact, 52% of the American people in one poll about 3 years ago said, if George Bush turns out to have lied about the reasons to go to Iraq, would you favor impeachment? How about that one? Think of it now. Huh? So where's the democracy when every senator and representative sworn to uphold the Constitution, which includes the impeachment clause, and they take it off the table, the Democrats. They win in November 06, finally, control of the House and Senate. First thing Pelosi and Harry Reid say, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, we're taking it off the table. That's like saying to Bush and Cheney, hey, you can continue to be outlaws. You continue to be above the law. You can continue to violate the law because the opposing party is too chicken, is too gutless, is too clueless, is too spineless to uphold their oath of the Constitution, as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and others hoped that their successors would do. Iraq, an endless quagmire. No one likes to be military occupied. The resistance will continue as long as we are militarily and corporately occupying that country. You want to knock out the bottom from the insurgency, bring the soldiers back home, stop spending $14 million an hour, 24 hours a day, on the Iraq War. You give them a deadline for corporate and military withdrawal. It'll take the Army about 6 months just to get out of there. But in the meantime, you can have UN-sponsored elections. You can have continuation of humanitarian aid. And you can have some peacekeepers from nearby Islamic countries. But in the meantime, you bring the three sectors together, Kurds, Shiites, Sunni, who want some autonomy within a unified Iraq. They worked it out in the 1950s. Bush and Cheney would never know that because they don't know any history whatsoever about the Middle East. And having done that, we're out of there. Because our big chip is to give Iraq back to the Iraqis. And the oil back to the Iraqis. And the tribal leaders. And the tribal leaders. And the religious leaders have very substantial authority, even though Iraq's in chaos. Very substantial authority. We'll have a stake, and they'll know the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. They're not doing it. Now, I've just given you 10 areas where we really have no democracy. Shelley Woolman, a professor emeritus in Princeton, just put out a book, Princeton University Press, called Democracy, Inc. And he's a very subtle scholar. I mean, you have strong democracies, weak democracies, in-between democracies. But there comes a point, he said, when it drops below the line and can no longer be called a democracy. And that's his verdict. Corporations control us in ways we're not even aware. For example, if I say the following words, what occurs to you in your mind? Crime, violence, regulation, welfare. Yeah, you're advanced. But for most of us, throughout our educational lives, we would think of street crime, wars, rapes. We'd think of government regulation, welfare for the poor, etc. But quantitatively, there's more corporate crime, more corporate violence, more corporate welfare that we pay them, subsidies, handouts, giveaways. Look at Bear Stearns' bailout, $29 billion on Wall Street, etc. And they regulate us far more than government, for the most part. Or they use government to regulate us. 16,000 people were subject to homicide last year in the U.S., street and household. Now compare the other preventable homicides. OSHA, 58,000 workers die from occupational disease and trauma. Some of them pretty horrible, horribly painful deaths every year. 65,000 people basically come down with cancer or can't breathe anymore because of air pollution. EPA figures. Almost 100,000 people die in hospitals from medical negligence or malpractice. 250 people a day die from hospital-induced infections. These are all preventable. And they tower over the street crime that's involved. Tower over, and I'm just giving you a few of the statistical sectors.